Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. So today I'd like to talk about mixing. So what makes a song sound good? So obviously you need there are three main elements in a song. So you have obviously the creation part. So you have the songwriting. So um, songwriting. Then you have, let's say, the putting together, so the arrangement. Let's call it arrangement. Um, then we have the production. That's quite important. So the production means what types of instruments are we using, what types of sounds, how are we getting these sounds to mix together. So production. So we have creation at the start, so the songwriting. Then we have the arrangement, trying to arrange the elements that were created in the previous phase, that was songwriting. Um, Subsequently, production, so the choice of instruments, what are we going to make it sound like, what type of instruments are we going to be using. And finally, let's say the polishing of these three elements in a way to maximize the quality of the sound um, is mixing. Mixing and let's say mixing and mastering. Mixing and master. So mixing and mastering generally go together. So they're two processes that aim at maximizing the quality of the sound and the way all the individual sounds are perceived by the listener. So it's basically trying to make it sound good, making a song sound good. You can have a great songwriting, you can have a great arrangement, a great production, but there's still 10-15% at the end that really makes a song sound good. And that means you can hear the individual instruments, you can feel the bass, you can hear the details in the words of whatever singer, if we're talking about pop music, for example. So today I'd like to focus on mixing. So let's focus on mixing. So mixing, we can divide mixing, I would say, generally in five areas. So you would have frequencies. So that means the EQ. Then we would have. So frequencies, what does that mean? Basically means what frequencies are we keeping from each instrument? Obviously, within a cue, that basically is a way of filtering out certain frequencies. We can choose, for example, in a bass, we don't need the high frequencies, so we'll cut off most of the high frequencies and keep the low. This will give more space for other instruments in the high end area. So, frequencies, left and right. So where is that instrument in the mix? Is it in your left ear? Is it in your right ear? Is it in both ears? If it's in both ears, it means it's in the center. If we generally talk about the bass or the kick drum, the low frequencies always go in the center. So they would be right and left. So another element of the mix would be reverb and spatial and spacing of where that instrument is. Is it forward in the mix or is it back in the mix? how do you get an instrument to be forward and how we get an instrument to be back. I'll get into that in a second. So reverb. Okay, so then what do we have? We have compression, very important. Compression was first used in radio stations so that the listeners could hear the details in the words and would be able to listen to moments in which the dialogue was quieter. So what does a compression do? It basically tries to keep the sound tries to keep the sound in a more uniform way. So if you have a very loud bit of music, the compressor would squash it. And if you have a very quiet bit of music, it would make it higher in volume. So compression. So in the radio stations, when people would talk, the listeners would be able to hear every single word, and this is very important. This generally also is found in mastering, for example. It's quite an important element. So we're 1, 2, 3, 4, and what are we missing? So frequencies, left and right, reverb, compression, and obviously volume. So what is the volume of the instrument? How intense is it perceived by the listener? So the volume is basically the energy that instrument is giving out and the number of decibels that instrument is creating. So let's start with frequencies. So I think most of you that have used DAW know how frequencies work because you have an EQ. So this is generally in most DAWs. This is what you're going to get. You're going to get a little box like this with 2 axes. On this axis, you're going to have the dBs, so the volume of the frequency, so dB. And on this axis, you'll have hertz. That is so hertz is basically the number of oscillations that a sound completes in 1 second. So when we're talking about low frequencies, for example, so this is a logarithmic scale here. So we would have 100 hertz. Then up here we would have 1,000, and up here 10,000. Okay, so 100 hertz, what does that mean? That means the speaker is moving forward and backwards 100 times in 1 second. So this is generally a very low sound. Human ear can start to perceive sounds at around 20 hertz. So for example, if I do that, or even slower, I'm moving at around 1 hertz, so 1 oscillation per second. So this is 1 hertz, and that's exactly what happens with a speaker. When the bass note hits, the electromagnets create movement, and they create movement say for a bass, that would be maybe a low bass would be around 80 hertz or 50 even for the lower notes, and that gives you the low punch. It gives you that energy that keeps you moving. That gives you that keeps up all the other instruments. So up here we have dBs. It's normally 3, 6, 9. So that's more or less how it would work. And so let's talk a bit about where the high frequencies are, where the low frequencies are. So here we have the low frequencies. So from 0 to 100, we're in the low area. So let's just from 100 to more or less 700, 800. That's around here. We have the mid lows. So this is 700, 800 here. So low, mid low. Then we have so we have the mid highs. So they start from mid high. That starts from around 700, 800 and gets to around 4K. So 4K. And from here onwards, we're talking about the high frequencies. Okay. So this goes to 20,000 hertz. That is the highest note. It's the highest note that humans can perceive. Obviously, in old age, this goes down to around 16,000. But when you're young, when you're in your 20s, you generally can get to 19,000 or 20,000. And obviously, for example, animals can hear a lot higher than that. So, for example, when we say that sound is boomy, it's got too much low end. So boominess would be around this area. So it's from your 20 hertz to your 50 hertz. Or say that sound, this mix sounds a little muddy. What does that mean? It means there are too much mid-lows. So the muddiness in your mix, that doesn't give it the clearness, generally comes in this area here. So that means you're probably going to have to look at a bunch of instruments and take the mid-lows out. The sound is a bit honky. So that would regard the kind of nasal sound you get at around 1,000 hertz. A good way to understand what frequency sounds, what each frequency sounds like, you can, on most programs, you can just upload a white sound and a white noise, and that means you basically have the same amount of energy for each frequency. That's the same kind of television sound, the white screen television. It's a noise sound basically. And what can you do? You can create a filter that's basically a Bell filter like this. And this basically cuts off the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies. And you can basically just pass the filter through the noise and hear each frequency. So it would probably sound like until you get to the 20,000 where you stop hearing. That gives a good idea of what frequency sounds like. So yeah, honkiness, nasal sound, that's around 1,000 hertz. That's one of your kind of the main areas of your voice, for example, in the mix, your voice would sit from around, depending on the mix, but we're talking about mid-high, high end for voices in most mixes. So, okay. So yes, also the sound, this song sounds a little bit crispy. So there are all these types of words that describe a certain area of frequency. So crispy would be around 4K, or it's too bright. This mix sounds too bright. So that would be talking about the high end. So we're talking about 10K upwards. So basically, what is the objective in a mix? It's getting each instrument to sit in one of these areas without disturbing the other instruments. So for example, what would we have in the high end? We would have some parts of the voice and mostly hi-hats or percussive elements like tambourines, etc. So that would probably live in the high end. In the mid-highs, you would have voice, a lot of the voice. You could have some of the tacks from some instruments. So, for example, when you hit a keyboard, the first attacky sound. When I say attacky sound, that means each sound always has a shape that goes more or less like this. So depending on the sound, for example, if I make a clap, that will be a very sharp attack and a very fast decay. So it would be something like that. For example, if you hit a piano note or a keyboard note, that would probably go up quite sharply depending on how on what the attack level is, and then slowly decay. So the attack basically means how rapidly the sound wave receives energy. So again, a fast attack would be very fast. That's going up very fast like this. And a slow attack would be something like this. Because the energy increases gradually and then decays. So again, a clap sound is something like this, something very immediate. A voice sound will have different areas. For example, when we're talking about, for example, the p and t sounds, so the quite harsh consonants, p and t will have quite a harsh attack. Instead, the vowels generally have a softer way of distributing the energy in the sound wave. So, in the mid-high range, we would have instruments like the piano, the guitar, for example, and these generally can move into the mid-lows also. So, for example, depending on the guitar, for example, a classical guitar might live more in the mid-lows just because of the nature of the instrument, and an acoustic guitar that's more a percussive instrument would live more in the mid-high or even highs at times. So depending on your instrument, you have to kind of decide where it's going to go in your mix. Obviously, you're not going to put the bass in the high end. Again, everything's possible. In some mixes you can find basses that use the mid-highs, highs, but in that case it would mean there would be something like a very full sounding kick drum that would fill up all those low frequencies. As a general rule of thumb, let's say the majority of mixes have the kick and the bass in the low end and in the mid lows. So, for example, maybe in a kick, So again, looking at the so this is again the EQ. So you have your dBs on this axis and the hertz on this axis. So the amount of energy and the frequencies. So okay. So for example, a kick drum. So a kick drum in your mix generally, how would you want to EQ it? So most kick drums are EQ'd something like this. So they have quite a solid low end. And this goes down in the mid lows. And then there's a little bump up here at around, depends on the mix, but normally it's around 1 to 2K, so 1 to 2K. And that's the very attack of the kick. Obviously, when you hit a percussive sound, for example the drums, you have the initial sound. So when you hit the skin of the drum, you will have a very attacky sound. So you will have a very intense release of energy from the skin hitting the beater. So that will be the attack, and then the attack will normally come through at around 1 to 2K, depending on the mix.